Moving on to look development. Look development scenes are there to make sure that all of our assets are not only consistent in their texturing and their shading, but also that they stay within the technical guidelines relating to things like colour, brightness, and shading quality. So look dev scenes require a few things. They require some shader balls, a Macbeth chart, or something else to gauge and check the colour space is accurate, a neutral light setup, and some scene lighting setups. It also needs to be in the correct and final colour space, which isn't a problem so much now that we have set up ACEs. So the shader balls are normally set to chrome, so we can check the reflections within the scene. A white ball, so we can understand what white is. In this case, it's set to 85%. We have a black, which is set to 4%. And we also have a mid-grey, which is set to 18%. Now, the white is set to something close to actual white, but not quite as bright as snow or white paint. So this is just to show the upper limits of what white should be on any generic surface. We also have 4% black, which pertains to the darkest blacks that you normally get within reality. And 18% grey, or 0.18, is set here for various photometric reasons outlined in the ACES documentation. But here, instead of a mid-grey on a shader ball, I have set this to be on the backdrop. So that takes us to the backdrop, which is a consistent background that we can use at all times. Here I have it set up behind the object, but we could remove this and just use a flat grey colour that we can add to the background. We also have the Macbeth chart that we mentioned before to compare the colours. This is especially useful for when we want to use coloured lighting setups, just so we can judge the entire shift within the scene and how that is affecting the colours on the Macbeth chart and on the objects themselves. Finally, we also have some light rigs. Now we would create some shot lighting setups to make sure that this asset will read correctly in the final render, and depending on the show it may have a few shot lighting setups. And finally, we have the studio or the neutral lighting setup, which allows us to check our textures without any shot or environment light interference. Now, look development in general is a lot more multifaceted than this, and scenes can be as complex as the project requires based on the stylized nature of any given project. This setup, however, is a solid base for any realistic scenes. So let's start on a new fresh scene. Let's put down a quick backdrop. Now I like to use the tube to get the middle bend and delete what it is we don't need, and then extrude from the top and the bottom. Now, in case you are unfamiliar with some of the workflows within Houdini, if we want to extrude the selected edge within the viewport, we would start to tab in the node that we want, for instance the poly extrude, but we would do this within the viewport, and then it does it to the selected object or the selected element within the scene. If we had done this here, it wouldn't have applied this group which dictates this edge here. So I also need to flip the normal direction here using this option. We just plug this in. There we go. And finally, I'll just add a subdivision to soften it all off. Next, I will drop down a few spheres that we can use for our shader balls. So let me just set these up. And I also want to add in the Macbeth chart. So I'll just use a grid for this. And I'm setting this up to be the resolution of the image that I have. Add some UVs. And use the scale to make them smaller. Let me just move this into place. So next I'll just create a material for these guys, just creating a shop net and adding the shaders inside. As I mentioned, we want the white to be about 0.85, and I'll just crank the roughness up. Same with the grey at 0.18. The black to 0.04. and chrome like before. Finally, we just have to add in the image map for the Macbeth chart. And in this case, I'll remove any specular reflection just to stop it from interfering with the colour. Nice. Let's just put down some material nodes to add these in. And I'll add a material to the backdrop here. Cool. So next I'll throw down the camera and just set this to a square ratio. (1080 by 1080 should be good. And I also want to increase the focal length, and this is just a personal preference. It would entirely depend on the project again, but I do like to set it a little bit higher to try and flatten the image a bit. And I'll just move this into position. Nice. And I would lock this off. Normally I'd lock this off. Okay, now lastly, I'll set up the lights setup. So just put down a few lights. Arnold lights. And we'll have two sky domes set to texture. One will be sky and the other the studio. Finally, this one will be the sun. Okay, so distant. I'll turn this one off for now and just link up the studio. So all the HDRs that I'm using here are from HDRI Haven, like we mentioned before. Here's the studio one. And the sky. And finally the sun with that little bit of warmth that we spoke about. Okay, so onto the ROP. Let's add down a new Arnold ROP. And it's already kind of set up. We have the samples at 3. And we're already on our main camera. So let me just render this and see what we've got. Okay, this looks nice, although I think the studio lighting is a bit backwards. That's better, we have the light coming in the front. And I have also set these balls to be too glossy. And the chrome could be a little darker. Nice, so studio lighting looks good. Let's take a look at the sun and sky. I'll leave the sky as it is for now and move the sun. And I just want this to be coming round the back a little. I could move it anywhere, and within a normal look depth scene, what I might do is animate the sun so we can see what it looks like from all the different angles. But something like this is fine for now. It's hard to judge until we get an asset in, and that's what we'll do next. So let's bring in the tree and start shading this. So one thing I do know is that this scene is going to be too small, so we will use a null just to scale everything up, but first we will bring in the tree. And these will be far too big because they come from speed tree. Speed tree is set to feet, whereas Houdini is set to meters, so they will be 3 times too big. And of course, we want to make sure that we're applying the material. Again, we can just do that here, dropping down a shop net. Of course, if we look through our camera, it's going to be far too small. So let's create a wider version of this. And I will use a null to scale everything up. And bring the tree a little further forward. And the background needs to be a bit wider. Nice, let's move these shader balls somewhere we can see them. And hit render again. Make sure I'm set to far here. Okay, so this works, but one thing we don't have, obviously, is some shaders for the tree. For now, I'll just apply a simple brown texture to the bark, just a brown colour. And leave the roughness at 1. Now for the pines, we have the SSS that we want to set up. So the first thing I want to do is make them a little green. Something like this. Let me just copy this. And I'll set this for the moment to 0.3 and paste this relative reference into the colour. Now if we change anything up here, it will also change it down here. It could be different, but for now let's keep it simple. So if I render this, it will give us some subsurface scattering. It will also be quite slow. Let me just remove the speck. Increase the roughness. So it does work. It's a little slow and it's a little diffuse. And arguably it's realistic, but one thing that we want to do when we're using any leaves or any foliage is, instead of just using the pure SSS, we want to check thin-walled. What this does is it changes it from being subsurface to just translucency. And then this becomes your back and front face scattering. Cool. Let me bring the sun a bit further around. And increase it because at the moment it's only at 1. Cool. So one thing that you might need to do is just increase the brightness on some of these on the subsurface if you're not finding that it's coming through the back enough. So let me just disconnect this for a moment. Just so you can see the difference. Cool. The last thing I want to do is just make sure that our sun has the correct angle. Nice. So this works for me. And at the moment I would probably just leave the bark as being brown. It does look a little strange here. It does look a little bright here. Let me just darken this down a bit. And I would probably be fine leaving it like this for distances and trees that we only see from a distance. Of course, if you saw this any closer, then you would need to add the texture or the bump, or even perhaps replace the trunk entirely with, say, a photogrammetry trunk or one that you have sculpted yourself. Cool. So next we'll take a look at adding some color variation using point colors and distributing them amongst the groups of trees. Thanks.